actually do echo this sentiment as well. And then I'm going to present to you the three frameworks that underpin um, problem solution fit. And then we're going to break it down to how we implement problem solution fit. And I'll give you two stories at the end as well. Now, you don't have to take screenshots of, I know in Indonesia, it's every time I do lectures, I see, cameras going up. You don't have to do that. I've already sent my slides over to Buzara, and they'll be disseminated after the session today. But I also want to close with a cautionary tale with the long road ahead, because problem solution fit is only one part of the entrepreneurial journey. So I want to end with that. Now, before I go further, if I am going too quickly, if you just let me know by the chat, I can see if chats come up. I'm happy to slow down, or if sort of, and I have timed this so that we have some time for Q&A at the end of the session if you want as well. So let me tell you a tale of two successful ventures. I'm pretty sure you would have heard, or you might have heard of this company. Has anyone heard of Air Bed and Breakfast? Probably some might guess it actually became what we know today as Airbnb. Airbnb was an interesting tale. So it was ideated in 2007. The founders had a really great idea that, what, people don't really want to stay in hotels, and they want to stay somewhere else. So in 2007, they created this concept, and then they got funded by Y Combinator, which is one of the biggest venture capital funding for entrepreneurial startups in 2009. But their revenue was flatlining at $200 a week, right? So they had this problem. They had a great idea. They believed they had the market, and yet their revenue would not grow and was just flatlining at $200 a week. The founders then realized that they had this pattern, right? There was this pattern. They reviewed the 40 plus listings that they had. They believed they had the great code. They had great listing. The format was great, great descriptions. But then they realized that the photos were actually really, really terrible. And in fact, one of the founders reflected and said, you couldn't even really see what it is that you were paying for. Now, if you can imagine, right, you want to stay in a hotel. Back then, most of the time, you actually don't know what the hotel rooms look like, right? You just say, oh, this is the hotel. It looks great from the outside. We're going to stay inside. However, Airbnb, or Air Bed and Breakfast at that stage, was quite different. Would you stay in a place, right, where you can't see the photos? So if you look at what actually happened was they decided to, let's go and validate this problem, right? So they went out, the three of them went out, they grabbed a professional camera, they went and visited all the listings they had and started taking really nicer photos. And what they found, that within a week of them updating the photos to nicer photos, their revenue doubled. So they were struggling for a year with the revenue not going up, and suddenly the revenue started doubling. And what they discovered was that the real problem here is actually consumer trust, right? And this idea of stranger danger. Imagine you're going to stay at someone's house and you don't know how it looks like. So they actually validated this way after. So if you look at this, right, this is a history. So the Web Design Museum had captured all what they saw. So initially, it looked like this, right? Air bed and breakfast. There was no pictures whatsoever. And then you had Airbnb. This was 2009. Find a place to stay. But with pictures like that, no one wanted to pay. Over time, it's evolved. And now even in places like Indonesia, in Bali, when I go to Bali, what do I book? I don't book hotels. I book an Airbnb, right? So they actually managed to validate the problem. And it was really interesting, right? So the question that they had, and if you look at the case studies on this, and I've given you the references if you want to look at them as well, is this question: how do you engineer trust in a peer-to-peer marketplace in 2009? And what all of the research that's been done on Airbnb basically said that they've been successful because they've been designing for trust. And in fact, if you look at the solution that Airbnb has today, it's that it has trust, reviews are subjective, are not, sort of subjective anymore. They're objective, and they're also really transparent. So if you stayed in an Airbnb, you can't just give someone a rating, right? It is always got to be reciprocal. That means you get rated as a guest, and the guest rates you as a host. Profiles now need to be verified, social connections, again, building that trust that the person exists, double blind reviews, secure payment. There's a host guarantee because people didn't want to list their homes to total strangers as well. And then from the customer's front, you've got this superhost program. So what they did was they created a product, but then the actual problem that they had wasn't the fact that people didn't want to stay in hotels, was how do you overcome a lack of trust. The second story that I have is Dropbox. I don't know how many of you use Dropbox. I was an early adopter of Dropbox. I had 4 years of free storage from Dropbox, and now I'm paying a lot of money for Dropbox. But Dropbox was also very interesting. It was started in 2007, and it was started because one of the founders had a real life problem. He was on a bus going to somewhere, and then he realized, do you remember these things? USBs. I know some of you are very young. You probably don't know what a thumb drive looks like. But in 2007, that was your livelihood, right? You didn't carry laptops around. Most of us did not have a laptop. Most of us used library computers or public computers. And our whole entire livelihood was in the thumb drive. He was traveling and he realized, oh no, I left my thumb drive. And in the US, where he traveled, it was a 2 hour journey back. So he couldn't go back instead of missing work, but he couldn't do his work. And so he discovered that there was this problem. So they created this idea of Dropbox, and it received Y Combinator funding in 2009. But what was interesting with Dropbox is that they actually didn't have, if you know the story, right? They actually didn't have the actual product itself. What he did was he created this little video, right? Which I'm going to play for you. This was the actual file that he did on his computer, a screenshot of something that did not exist. He created a demo of a product and then started showing people this product. Hey, would you actually buy this? Right? And what was interesting is, again, they didn't have the product, but they built belief. So if you watch this, they then invited you, sign up and you get free storage. I was one of the millions of people who signed up in 2009 because I was doing my PhD and I didn't want to lug around my laptop all the time. They validated not the product, but they validated the problem before building the product. This is really interesting, right? They then grew and scaled through a freemium model. Basically, if you signed up early, you had, I can't remember, I think it was 500 or 250 megabytes for free per year. If you referred another person, you get another 50, right? And back then, those storage spaces were pretty much a premium. And the focus that they had was really simple. That is, we want to make sure that the user experience is simple. And even till today, if you log into Dropbox, it looks exactly like this. So despite the fact that Google gave a lot of people free Google Drive accounts, people like myself stuck on with Dropbox because it's simple. Microsoft and SharePoint, I still pay for my Dropbox. And today they're one of the biggest storage companies outside. What do these two companies have in common? Well, I like to call this the beautifully engineered solution, right? But the biggest differentiator is from Airbnb, it was a beautifully engineered solution to a problem that nobody had, whereby for Dropbox, it was a beautifully engineered solution to a problem that a lot of people had. So how do we come to this, right? Now, a couple of facts, if I can anchor this, sort of this lecture on, is that most ventures actually don't fail at scaling, right? They actually fail at the very first step, and that is misunderstanding the problem. And the way to overcome this, right? So Eric Ries in the Lean Startup, one of the seminal texts when it comes to thinking about entrepreneurship and the book Lean Startup, he argues that the only way to win is to learn faster than anyone else. If you think about Airbnb, it wasn't because they were first to the market, but they were the first to realize that trust is the key issue and not so much the problem itself. And Blank, Steve Blank and Dorff basically says this, and I've paraphrased this slightly, that there are no facts inside your building, so you have to go outside and get the facts. When you are thinking about problems, you can't just look inside, you can't just trust your own intuition, but you have to look outside. And both cases of Airbnb and Dropbox, for me, demonstrate the benefits of implementing PSF, right? First is that Airbnb argues that we are going to redefine the problem, not the solution. Whereby for Dropbox, they took the step of let's validate the problem plus this idea of solution desirability before building. So how does that look like? So problem solution fit is an alignment. Its definition is, many definition, but the simplest definition is an alignment between a clearly validated problem and a proposed solution, right? And how do you build that? Well, it provides an evidence that the problem is real. You haven't imagined the problem. The problem is real, that the problem is important, and more importantly, that the solution is meaningfully better than any alternatives out there. So when you think about entrepreneurship in the space of the business canvas model or the lean startup model thinking, this is really important because if the problem isn't real, your solution is not going to work. If the problem is not important, who would care about the solution? And if the solution is not meaningfully better, well, why would I buy your product or come to you or utilize your services? There's this line, I can't quite figure out where I got this from, but I like to collect quotes, and this is one of the quotes that I had from 2007, and that is, customers don't buy solutions, they hire the outcomes. Again, customers don't buy solutions, they hire outcomes. If customers buy something, that's it. One purchase, it's done. You don't have any meaningful engagement, right? But if you come back as a repeat customer, it's because they're willing to pay the arbitrage fee that you bring as a business owner, as a product, or as a service. And they like the outcome that you bring, whether it's nicer food, whether it's nicer coffee, whether it's, quicker way of shopping, but basically they're hiring the outcomes. Now, let me spend 2 minutes on philosophical approaches, right? So basically, if you compare entrepreneurship approaches, there's two distinctively, I would say, paradigms when it comes to thinking about entrepreneurship. The first is the lean startup, which again, I'm not going to go through in too much details. I know you guys are going through this, right? But at its essence, it's really reducing uncertainty by formulating what we call working guesses, right? We have a hypothesis, let's test this. We're guessing if this actually works, and it's a scientific method. Step by step, you start with discovering what is market demand and how do you address that market demand. And it helps entrepreneurs think about what needs to be done without any restrictions, right? So it's really blue sky thinking. Now, on the other hand, there is this concept of effectuation. Now, you might not cover this, but sometimes, as an entrepreneur myself, when I reflect back and whenever I look at the lean startup, I don't quite feel that I've ever done it that way. I've done it a different way. And this other perspective is called effectuation. And effectuation is basically you focusing on controlling the future rather than predicting it. So instead of a step by step, what is the big problem? And let's try to create that problem. Effectuation basically starts with what do I have, right? It's and the authors call this the bird in hand principle. Who are you? What do you know? Whom do you know? How much can you afford to lose, right? And therefore, when you start with that and you build your product and your solution, you basically get to something very similar to the lean startup process. Now, these two perspectives, irrespective of which one you hold, the problem solution fit method actually still works. Now, it is the discipline before scale, right? So in his book, Blank basically argues that the lean startup process is divided into search and execution. And then you start with the customer discovery. You got to stop, you got to validate it, and then you might need to pivot and go back to step one before you then start executing. And so it's really at its heart, um, the theory building phase, right? You guys are at university, and part of the things that whenever you learn, they talk a lot about theory, theory, theory. Theory and theorizing is actually really important. It has so much practical uses. And it's the process of theory building and then testing the problem. You then basically, it is guided, codified, and often tracked using the business model canvas. Again, I'm not going to go through this into much details because I know you guys have got a lot of components in this. And the biggest, I suppose, insight that I had when I was looking at the problem solution fit for the very first time is that it's really important that the theory of potential business, right? Again, I'll repeat that the theory of potential business, not the theory of your business, but the theory of what your business could be, must be developed before customer testing happens. That makes a lot of sense, but you'd be surprised at how many times people actually skip this step. So problem testing, according to Blank, right? You run ethnographic interviews, and again, I'll articulate this a little bit more later. And then you need to run what he calls experimentations, and that is you running experiments. How do you resolve the unknown? By testing the validity of the different hypotheses. And then, only then, right, you think about how do you develop and sell the MVP, the minimum viable product. A lot of entrepreneurs, what they do is before they start validating the problem, they have an idea and they go, let's race to build the MVP and let's test the MVP. But the MVP should only come after the PSF steps. And I'll hopefully unpack over the next hour or so why. Are we going okay? Am I going too fast? Is it okay? All good? All right. So I'm going to provide you with three different frameworks, right? And the three different frameworks are the lean startup, as underpinning principles behind the PSF. So basically, there's this idea of build, measure, learn, right? And this is a loop that happens all the time. And that, again, like I said earlier, PSF must sit before meaningful MVP and scaling. The second framework is Blank's customer development, right? That customer discovery must happen before validating them. So, as part of the problem solution fit, is also identifying who your customer is and what is it that they need. Um, and the key important part here is that you're not testing your ideas, right? I know in week one, you and week one and week two, you'd be thinking about what is ideation? What is a great idea? How do you come up with a great idea? And some of you might already have a great idea. Problem solution fit is not about testing your idea, right? It is testing the assumptions behind your idea. You might have a great idea. What are the assumptions behind it? And that's what this process is trying to unpack. And last but not least, it's a relatively new theory. It's called the continuous framework, rather, I should say, rather than theory. It's the continuous validation framework. And basically, it borrows from the knowledge management literature and argues that knowledge translation, right, is a key important key important element of business model design. And that value proposition emerges after the problem solution fit. So the authors, basically, Kobo and colleagues, right? Start with this. If you can see on my bottom right-hand corner, stage one is discover, right? What is the problem to solve? So you identify what the problem is, you come up with a solution, and then you go through this little loop, right? Which is the build, measure, learn loop, and then you generate a value proposition. But what they argue is after that, you then have to validate. And sometimes your validation, it comes back to the problem, right? Because Airbnb, they went through this. If you think about it, Airbnb went through this. And then what did they realize? Well, $200 revenue a week. I think it cost them at that stage about $15,000 a week to host their service, right? So they were bleeding so much money. How do you actually, is this actually really worth solving? Is this a problem worth solving? Was the question they asked. Now, once you validate, and through this process of validation, you can then go through the concept, the code, the MVP, and then you revalidate it, right? So it's basically they're arguing that there are four components to this: Stage one, discover. Stage two, define. Stage three, delivery. And stage four, measurement. And what I find interesting about this framework, right, especially the continuous validation framework, is that it fits in, it takes elements of the lean startup, the customer development, and it actually helps you to avoid premature product development, right? Because if you think about this, and I've put up here the business model canvas, what you see in here in the problem solution fit stage is that it is really only in the key activities and value proposition that they bring in, right? This is, it doesn't fit in the whole entire component. So this forms a really key part of what the PSF is. It's really, what are your key activities? What is your value proposition? Right? Again, it doesn't talk about the resources that you have because that is outside of the problem solution fit, right? You might not have the current resources, but what are the key activities that you might need? Because if you have the key activities and you understand your value, you can then go and find new key partners who you might not have put in before. You might then develop the key resources that you need to develop and address the problem. Think about Dropbox, right? This was one guy sitting on a bus, realizing, oh no, I've left my thumb drive. Hey, let's create a video and validate the product. Well, not really. Validate my idea. Well, not really. What was he trying to validate? Well, he was trying to test if the solution is worthwhile buying. Did he have any key partners? No. Did he have any resources? No, he didn't. Right? It was literally a simulated environment on a computer through screen grab. And they were able to develop it. And I believe this is actually one of the key values of the problem solution fit. Um, okay, so implementing the PSF, right? So I have broken this down into three. Now, I do apologize. I should have said in advance, my referencing for keynote speeches is usually using footnotes, which is not the right way to do it. I know, but it's the easiest, most cleanest way to get the slides looking like it's not an academic slide. So you will find the, there's footnotes for you. But based on my personal reflection, personal understanding of the entrepreneurship literature, I believe that there are three stacks to the PSF, right? So this is, you can cite me. It's a work in progress that I've developed over the years. But basically, I believe that PSF can be seen as a stack of three layers, and you got to do them together, right? So the first is the problem clarity, right? And the question that we ask is, are we solving something real, something important, and it's already happening? The second layer is the customer evidence. Do we actually have real world evidence, not just assumptions? And last but not least is this idea of solution resonance, right? Does the solution actually trigger real commitment, not just interest? So let's break this down a little bit further. And again, I'm drawing on various components of the academic literature, and I'll bring in a personal story, I promise you, after this as well. Now, I like to call this the initial hypothesis layer, right? So step one is problem clarity. You have to hypothesize. If there is one thing, I've had the privilege of teaching, I calculated the other day, I've had the privilege because the unit that Zara and I taught in when I was at Monash, it was one of the largest units in, I think, anywhere around the world when it comes to teaching management. We had anywhere between 800 to 1,000 students per class each semester. And I was teaching across 4 campuses. I've had the privilege, I calculated the other day, I think I've taught over 10,000 students. And people often ask me, what is the one key benefit of going to university versus going through the school of hard knocks, right? And I had thought long and hard about this. And actually, the only benefit, and I can say this with clear certainty, the only benefit that you will get from doing university is that you learn what is a hypothesis, and whether you know it or not, every single one of your assignments, every single one of your exams actually forces you to validate a hypothesis, right? We have subject learning outcomes, and that's our hypothesis as to what you will get out of a class. and the exam validates it and tests it. Um, Currently, I have the privilege of running Australia's largest online MBA program. It's amazing. My students vary from someone who's worked for 15 to 20 years with no degree, no S1, right? No S1. They finish high school, they finish SMA, they work for 15, 20 years, and they found themselves in middle management. They're earning good money, but they can never be a managing director. They can never be CEO. They can never be a director, right? So what do? Well, they come and study with us through an MBA. On the other hand, we've also got students like yourself who's done a great undergrad degree, doing a master's or have run successful businesses, and you just want to validate that experience. Every single graduation, when we ask our students, what is it that you've learned? All of them say this. Doing the MBA gives us the words to explain things that we've observed in the real world, right? That is hypothesizing. And I want you to think if there was, I'll give you a tip, right? Out of your 5 things, this is unofficial, but you can write it anyway. One of the 5 things, key takeaway, right? Number one, you must understand how hypothesizing works and what is a hypothesis. You can't define a problem unless you understand what is a hypothesis, right? And there are 3 tests to this. The first, for me, is the frequency, right? This is what I call the problem recurrence hypothesis. How often does it happen? Does it happen often or does it happen rarely? Right? And again, the answer is not, it determines the solution that you have. But this is a question that you must be able to address. Otherwise, you won't be able to identify your customers. The second is friction, right? This is what I call the pain intensity hypothesis, right? How painful is this problem that people are willing to pay to resolve it, right? And again, it's a hypothesis, right? At this stage, problem clarity, it's all a hypothesis. I think people will pay to not forget to bring their thumb drive. Dropbox. Friction. How much are you willing to pay? Well, back in the day, a thumb drive cost, believe it or not, 40,000 $40 US, right? Was when I first started having them. It was $40 US. If you calculate it to rupiah, it's, I don't know how much is the rupiah now. It's probably what I'd say 600,000 rupiah. Just, is that 600,000 or a bit more? I can't remember. I think it's about there, right? Just to have one, right? But that's a fixed cost. My Dropbox subscription currently costs me $300 a year, right? So it costs me $30. I can buy 12 thumb drives a year. But this pain of me forgetting a thumb drive and not being able to work back in the day was high enough for me to go, maybe I should buy a thumb drive every month, with the exception that I don't have 12 discs, but I can go anywhere and I still will have it. And what is the alternatives available, right? And this is the current behavior hypothesis, right? What is it that currently your customers or your potential customers have access to? Back in those days, nothing, right? And for Dropbox, it's quite interesting. So what you get is this idea that your problem finding and problem solving becomes what I call, not just me, but drawing on very seminal work by Simon. It's what he calls a meaningful problem solution pairing, right? When you've got a problem and a solution that is well fitted together, it becomes a meaningful problem solution pairing. And what we must also understand is that problem solving is not just about logic, right? There is also elements of affective, right? That is your emotions, as well as the motivational factors. So when you look at the frequency, it's not just how logical this is, but what is the behavior and how can you challenge that behavior? And psychology has this, theory called the Gestalt theory. And the Gestalt theory is quite interesting. It's basically if you have problems, right? Sort of you can't see past a particular problem. Psychology tells you that, hey, if you shift how you view the problem, right, you can then produce successful solutions. It's like math. I don't know if you remember your basic math, right? So sometimes when you have a really difficult equation, I remember my teachers in Indo, actually, when I was in primary school, in SD, right? And he would cover one side of the equation and he said, if you look at this, right? And back then was chalk, so he couldn't erase it, right? And then he would take the other paper and cover the other bit. If you look at this long equation and break it down, you can actually come up with a solution. And the same applies for problem clarity. The same applies for the first stack. Now, stack number two is the customer evidence. This is where it gets interesting, right? When it comes to problem solving, problem solution fit, this is what I call the evidence generation engine. So while you first have got your hypothesis stack, right? Your initial hypothesis stack, this is where you generate your evidence. And this is by far the most underbaked, if I can use that word, the most underdone and underbaked things that a lot of startups fail to do, right? You built the MVP. You've got a great problem. Let's build the MVP. What about validation? Now, this validation is really, really important. Airbnb really did not validate their problems, right? The reason as to why they only discovered that trust was an issue later on was that I believe they didn't go through this customer evidence enough, right? They had a great idea, they built it, and then they realized why is people are signing up, but nobody's buying, right? Because there is a problem that they did not identify, and they would have identified it had they gone through this particular stage. Whereby Dropbox started almost with this, right? They didn't have a product, they had an idea, and they went, let's test this. Let's ask the customers whether you'll sign up for it. So this is where intuition. Now, intuition is something that all great entrepreneurs and all, any innovators would have, right? Even if you don't think you're an intuitive person, you are. It's that still small voice inside your heart that you go, I think this could work. Biggest difference is that people who go, I think this could work, and it becoming a successful business versus I think this could work, but I don't think I want to do it, is that you never go through this particular stage, right? And so what Reese argues in the Lean Startup is that you need to replace intuition with build, measure, and learn loops, right? So at any stage, if you have an intuition, he's not saying forget your intuition, but you need to replace it, right? You've got a feeling, great. Build it, measure it, and learn. What is the lesson that you have out of that? That becomes a guide for your intuition. And basically, if you think back all the way to Karl Popper, again, if you do your PhD at some stage, some of you might end up doing a PhD, you'll come across this guy's name, but you'll never read his work, right? I actually read his work. I had to read his work because I was reviewing a paper 10 years after I finished my PhD. And then I realized what a hypothesis is, right? Karl Popper basically wrote this seminal piece about science as falsification. Basically, science, there's no truth about science. And he argues that science is built on assumptions. There is so many assumptions. In fact, if you study economics, you'll know the term ceteris paribus, right? Everything being constant doesn't happen in real life. But when it comes to this particular stack, you have to unpack every single assumption. The biggest, hardest thing to do when it comes to customer evidence is you got to explicitly state every single assumption that you have. So once you've got the idea, you come up with a problem, right? You're very clear. This is where you sit down and go, what are my assumptions? Did I assume that my customers would go through a linear journey? Do I assume that my customers would be happy paying this amount of money, right? Every single assumption stated, systematically test the assumption, right? Now, this is really hard because this is the step that doesn't earn you any money. In fact, this will cost you so much time and so much effort. But it's also, I believe, is the make or break, right? When it comes to solving the problem solution fit. And last but not least, it has to be iteratively refined. It cannot just be a one time thing. You have to continuously develop this. And what do you get, right? So, in his book, Steve Blank, it was really interesting. He argues that, as academics, if we do research, we go, how many interviews do you undertake? Well, I undertake, on average, about 10 to 20 interviews, but I will stop once I hit what is called saturation in the data, right? That means if enough people are saying the same thing, I will stop. However, Blank argues that when it comes to this particular thing, right, you need a minimum of 30 to 50 to basically get a baseline, right? And this basically becomes a structured experiment. So it's you going undertaking an ethnographic interview. That means asking people, who are you? Tell me a little bit more about you. Not just, hey, will you use this product, right? But tell me a little bit more about you. What are some of the issues that you might have, right? Is there a problem I can help you solve today, right? These are the kinds of interviews. So it's very time consuming. You also will undertake what we call observational insights, right? That means you take a look, you stop, and sometimes it's just a matter of you sitting down and watching people go by. In fact, if you read stories about successful entrepreneurs, there was one, an Australian case that is not published yet. It's going to get published by one of my colleagues. And he said, this successful hotelier in Australia, right? He spent 6 months before building his boutique hotel. He spent 6 months basically not staying, but spending 6 hours in the lobbies of every single hotel in Melbourne. For 6 months, he just sat there and watched what people struggled with and watched what people liked, what brought people joy, every single hotel, right? And he codified this into a massive book. He was a hotelier. Now he's just launching what he believes, and I think has the potential to redefine how hotels get customers. Because from this observational insights, he went, actually, hotel designs are completely wrong. Toilet should be placed here, right? Check-in counters should be placed here. How? Because he's got the evidence. And again, it's really important, right? Chris Agris, in his seminal work, talks about double loop learning for organizations, for individuals. That means you don't just learn once, but you got to learn it multiple times and through different sources. And the same, right, goes with customer evidence. You have to continuously do this. So validation, right? Second takeaway, validation is not a milestone. Don't look at validation as a milestone in your journey, but validation actually is part of the loop that helps you go from your problem to developing potentially an MVP and then potentially refining it, right? It doesn't ever stop. And that's how and why entrepreneurship is so sexy, if I can call it that, but also so difficult because it is time consuming. Then stack number three, right, is the solution resonance. And this is the solution hypothesis testing layer. This is where you try to solve, right? And the two key questions here are, for the majority of the time, I would say is, would you switch, right? So you've got a problem, you get some evidence, but you would be asking this, would you actually switch? Would you change from drinking Coca-Cola to Indo Cola, right? Tastes the same, biggest difference, made in Indo, right? Would you switch? That's the behavioral displacement test. And how much would you pay for it? Would you pay, I don't know how much a can of Coke is in Indonesia at the moment, but imagine if made in Indonesia, it's 10 times costlier than Coca-Cola. Would you pay for it? Right? Well, you should be proud, right? Indonesians, we should be proud Indonesians. Why won't you pay for something that helps the country, right? So again, behavioral displacement tests and value validation tests. And this is how you build and test your MVPs, right? The value and growth hypothesis, right? And you can only build and test this, the testing, needs to be measured through signals, right? And there are signals. So the question here, right, is not whether customers like your idea, it's how much they're actually willing to give up to use it. Let me give you an example. Let's bring you back to the start of the talk. Airbnb, right? Now, imagine it was 2007. I was traveling and I wanted to stay in a place other than a hotel. What would I be able to, what am I giving up? I'm giving up on a loyalty program. I'm giving up on the prestige, right? Of staying in a nice hotel. I'm giving up on room service. But am I willing to give those up for an authentic experience in a different city? Maybe. Am I willing to give those up for the fact that I can have, compor and fridge? Am I willing to give those up so I can wash my clothes? Yes, yes, yes. I can give those up, and then only then I'll sign on with Airbnb. So the evidence letter, as I call it, basically starts with, and this is, I have to say this is not a validated theory, right? This is my personal observation based on a couple of scientific things. So you can cite don't cite this as a theory, right? Develop your own framework. But this is basically, I believe it starts with the stated interest, right? So someone is interested, and they go, yeah, I like it. I click like. I like it. I like this idea, right? But Richter, right? Again, seminal work, 1966, economics theory, argues that there is a difference between revealed presence, right, and stated preference. Stated preference is something that you say, oh yeah, I like that. It's cheap. However, revealed presence is when you understand, oh, this is what someone actually thinks, right? So it's really important to understand the difference between the two because commitment is signal strength, right? Clicking like on something is really easy. I don't know how many of you have ever clicked like on things that doesn't actually matter. However, when you have to pay money to support something, to show that I prefer this over that, that becomes a credible component. And Rogers, in his again another seminal work that I draw on, the diffusion of innovation, 1962, right? He argues that if you can justify the effort, right, effort justification will lead to adoption behavior. People will only adopt new technology, new products, new services if they can justify the effort that it takes for them to change their behaviors or the effort that it takes for them to pivot away from the current solutions they have. Now, number three takeaway is that actually, as entrepreneurs, you're not building products. I think this is the biggest pitfall of entrepreneurship is that you think I'm here to build products. In fact, what you need to be doing is running experiments in real time. And this is why undertaking entrepreneurial courses, entrepreneurship courses is so useful, right? You're not building products. What you're doing is running experiments from time to time and time again. Now, what are some of the lessons from integrating these three stacks? I'll go through them fairly quickly, right? So the the scientific basis for this is that knowledge advances through hypothesis, right? But only those that can be tested and challenges. So if you don't have a hypothesis that can be tested and challenges, you will not gain the knowledge from the problem clarity. So you cannot test something that is unclear. It must be clear and explicitly stated. Stack number two, your customer evidence. Don't be running business plans. In fact, that is the one sure thing that will kill your business, right? Run the experiments. And instead of assumptions, you're trying to gather evidence. And last but not least, solution resonance. Solutions never ever emerge fully formed. It has to continuously loop into each other. And it evolves through cycles of testing and refinement. I'll give you three examples of companies that do this really well. A lot of you know what Instagram is, use Instagram, but you might not have heard of Bourbon. Bourbon was how Instagram started. And they had followers, but it was clunky. They didn't have, um, they didn't understand what the users wanted. So the founders of Bourbon basically went and asked their customers, what do you like about our platform? I was an early adopter of Bourbon. It shows my age, right? This was pre-Instagram days. I was taking photos and sharing. And I said, well, I remember responding to this survey and going, I have Facebook if I want to write things. Twitter was at its infancy, but there is that. But what we don't have is a place to share nice photos, right? Because uploading photos on Facebook back in 2007 is really terrible. Um, and so what the founders did was they gathered this evidence and they discovered the problem is not that the world needs a better Facebook. The problem is that people don't have the means to share beautiful photos. So Bourbon then started developing filters, then it evolved into Instagram, and today I don't think you'll ever find a picture that hasn't used a filter, right? It's really interesting. Spotify is another interesting case. Spotify's problem is not that people found it really hard to listen to music, but it was just really inconvenient. And Spotify's market dominance is because you can have all the music at your fingertips. You're not limited to your downloads. You're not limited to your device size. You can stream this at any time. And there's a US company that I always like to use, and that's Casper. And Casper's really interesting. If you buy a mattress, right? Being an adult, I still remember at 21, I came to Australia, and one of the first choices I had to do was to pick a mattress. You know how difficult it is to buy a mattress in the Western world? The number of choices you have. Would you like soft, medium, hard, extra hard? Do you want latex? Do you want spring? Do you want it thick? Do you want it thin? Do you want different sizes? So what Casper did, again, in the early 2000s was they said customers had too many choices. What if we simplified it to a group of 5 or 6 components that customers can choose, right? So they were given basically a decision tree. Choose A or B. All right, great. Choose A or B. And by the time you go through that, they would recommend a mattress for you, right? And that particular behavior now shapes a lot of things that we see. Where is the power of the stack? Sequence does absolutely matter. Now, it's really important that with the stack that you don't skip any of the stack, right? Don't test stack number 3 before you test stack number 1. It's really important. There is no point testing the solution resonance if the problem is not clear or if there is weak evidence. The value, right? The value proposition examples are this. When you have a strong solution to a weak problem, you will not get adoption. Right? So if as you're thinking about your ideas, I know you have your assessments to go through, right? If you have a strong solution but a weak problem, there won't be any adoption. What should you go back and do? Well, let's focus back on refining what that problem is, right? Because that isn't going to actually work. Again, if you think about Airbnb, right? They had a strong solution. The problem was not people wanting to stay outside of hotels, but the problem was trust, right? So they had their strong solution, then they had a strong problem, right? There was adoption. If you have a strong problem, but you have a weak solution, customers are going to be frustrated, right? It almost does the job, but it doesn't do the job. I think it's the worst. It's the worst outcome of the lot, right? Imagine you're thirsty, and you go, "Oh, this water will quench your thirst, 3%." So you drink 1 whole liter, and I'm still thirsty. You will get so annoyed, right? This is really important. If you have a strong problem, a strong solution, but you have weak resonance, it'll be interesting, but again, no one will use it. And the PSF is also useful for diagnostic use. And this is when if your startup is already gone past the MVP stage and you're already at the scaling stage, it's still useful, right? And you ask questions like, did we misunderstand the problem? Because that's the hypothesis. Did we lack the evidence? Should we go out and get more evidence? And did the solution not resonate with the customers? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a few two personal stories, right? After this. But basically, I want to make a couple of key, sort of provocational statements, if I can, right? It is that problem solution fit doesn't just occur or it's not just valuable in entrepreneurship. It is actually a universal lens, right? You can apply it through any framework of entrepreneurship theory. You can apply it to any business problem. You can apply it to any personal problem. Your girlfriend, or the girl you like, or the guy you like is not talking to you. Well, undertake the problem solution fit, right? What is the theory? Come up with some theories. Why would someone like me? What would the person like? Get some evidence. Ask your friends, ask their friends, and then find a solution. Again, right? It is applicable across all situations and scenarios. With entrepreneurship, irrespective of whichever philosophical approach you undertake, the PSF exists and can be an anchor in there. It is actually not an ideology, right? It is literally a practical discipline. The more you do this, the easier it is to get things done. And I can personally tell you, I have a PSF. It sounds terrible, but I go through this mentally almost all the time, right? Before when someone comes up with a problem, I will ask myself this question: well, what is really the problem? Let's hypothesize. What are the assumptions behind those problems? I manage, 32 very smart PhD holders from all over the world, and I think I'm only older than two of them, right? I work with grandmothers, I work with, people who are 10, 15, 20 years older than me, way more experienced than me, but they come to seek me for help. And sometimes I go, well, what are you, the reason why I can come up with a bit of wisdom is I apply this questioning, right? Let's hypothesize what is the problem and let's try to come up with an understanding before we create a solution, right? So it's literally a practical discipline. And a key important lesson here is that behavior actually reveals the truth, right? It's not so much the evidence that you get from observation, but what is the behavior? Trust signals for Airbnb unlocked the adoption. The moment they understood that people could start trusting listings on Airbnb, people started doing it. Dropbox, right? There was demand validation. People were signing up, right? I was one of, I couldn't believe this, but it was 150,000 people signed up to Dropbox after watching that low resolution YouTube video that said, hey, we actually haven't built this product, but this is what it will look like. You want to sign up? Give us your email. Really interesting, right? I think that actually triggered, really interestingly, it triggered Dropbox. Now, let me stop sharing for a bit, and I will unhide two slides that I will show you. So I'll be very, if I can be, if I can ask that, sort of, again, I'm happy to share this, but there are some things that are a little bit commercial in confidence, so I haven't put it in the slide pack. But basically, I came to, I'll give you a bit of personal story, right? No good lecture ever happens without a personal story, so I'll give you two. Hopefully you'll rate me highly. So I was born in Sukabumi, in West Java, not too far from where you guys, I think the majority of you are. And I went to Singapore as an 11-year-old boy. That's where I learned English, spent the next, I think it was 11 years of my life, 10, 11 years of my life in Singapore. And then my parents asked, do you want to come back to Indo, work in the family business, or do you want to go somewhere else? Being young, I said, oh, you're giving me the option. Of course, I'll go somewhere else. So for some reason, I chose Monash, ended up in Melbourne, and I arrived from Singapore in 2007. And I don't know if you can tell, but behind me, my messy room, you can see shapes hanging. They're all guitars. I have a guitar hobby. I have 36 guitars in my office at the moment and about 20 more in storage, right? I have a problem. It's my addiction, one of my addiction. And what was interesting was I had not a lot of money. I collected a few gear in Singapore. As a guitarist, we like to buy a lot of accessories, guitar pedals, multiple guitars. They sound different, feel different, but to 90% of the population, they sound the same, just look different. But we like unique things. And when I came to Australia, I found a really interesting thing, and that was there was a massive pricing anomaly, right? Right? So I could have bought something in Singapore for I actually prepared this guitar pedal. So guitar pedal looks like this, right? Um, and I could buy this in Singapore for $110. When I landed in Australia, the same exact product is $300. And I went, hang on, that doesn't make sense, right? Why would that be? So there was this pricing anomaly, and that meant that I, as an international student, I couldn't justify spending too much of do it papa mama, I can't, right? Because it's they work hard, and I'm in a different country. And then I had this idea: what if I could import these products from Singapore and sell them online? But there was also an interesting context in that in 2007, eBay was, in Australia was taking off, right? And there is this mantra: you must try musical instruments before you buy it, right? It's true for a lot of things. People won't buy pianos, for instance, right? Till today, people won't buy pianos unless they go into the piano store. Well, the majority of them won't. However, if you're price conscious, you can. So I like to call this phase of my life Rock Logic Melbourne. I set up this company. It started with a mismatch, but it was actually my tagline is selling musical instruments online before it was a normal thing, right? And how did I clarify the problem? This is how my PSF stack works. Stack number one, I noticed that musicians were buying products and musical instruments very regularly, right? And there was this thing called forums. I don't know if any one of you ever go out onto forums, but we were buying and selling through forums. There were also a little bit of eBay sales. And there was this really interesting friction, like I mentioned, right? Sometimes prices were up to 100% higher in Australia, and it was across the board. And as a student, as a musician, often very poor, as a hobbyist, it's really hard to afford these things. And the existing alternatives were there were a couple of really big music stores. There were secondhand forums, but it was informal, it was fragmented. And some people do direct imports, right? But direct importing was had complex rules. Australian taxation system, customs, you don't want to play with them. You get caught. Unlike Indonesia, you get caught, you will get fined and you will go to jail, right? So it's with Indonesia, there's a lot of loopholes that you can try to take. Australia is very clean cut. So step number two, what did I do? And this was, in 2007, within a month of me arriving in Australia. I still remember. I interviewed musicians, right? And by interview, I meant I'm gigging, I'm playing out in pubs after uni, Thursday night, 5 p.m. Back then I used to smoke. So, you play the gig and then you take a smoke break and you chat with them. And it was really interesting, right? I asked them, where do you buy your gear? Oh, I only wait till I buy secondhand or someone gives it to me. It's too expensive. And I started asking these questions, right? Why don't you buy from forums? I would buy online, but I don't know who I'm buying from, right? So I collected these interviews, and over a period of 3 months, I was gigging, 3 to 4 days a week. Um, and I used to work in the industry as well. I started observing that there was a clear pattern. And then my observational insight, there's this strong forum trading. A lot of people were buying and selling musical instruments without having seen them, right? Sometimes it's just a picture, sometimes it's just words. And I go, if people can buy that, right? Um, People trusted other musicians. So I went, right, I'm a musician. So I created this literally in Microsoft Word document, right? I copied and pasted Rock Logic Melbourne. That's my logo. And I had these learning loops. People were already transacting without trying instruments physically. Then I realized, what could I sell, right? Guitars, guitar pedals, guitars, and cables, they actually don't break. So warranty actually doesn't make a difference. So I started doing this. And then I realized that customs import duties were actually easily done if you understood and had an inside person. But the arbitrage has to be large enough, right? And this was where it is a pricing reality, right? Rather than actually a problem that we had. Then I went through the third stack, right? Which you can see here. Would customers actually switch? So I did, right? They went from expensive retail, unreliable secondhand to being able to buy something new. If you have got significantly cheaper pricing, I think they'll do it, right? And there was a clear value proposition. I didn't have to sell it to them that you should buy this online, but you can do something else. So I started with a clip-on guitar tuner, which I no longer have the cheap version of. This was my MVP. I had three MVPs, right? The first MVP was the clip-on guitar tuners. Australian stores were selling them for $25 to $30. I realized that I can get them from China if I bought 1,000, right, for $2. Landed in 2007. Now I didn't have $2,000, but it's okay. I worked lots of jobs. I scrubbed floors, right? And I discovered that I was willing to lose, right? This is effectuation, right? Not lean startup thinking, effectuation. I was willing to lose $2,000. It's okay, right? Because I earned it. It was not my parents' money. I was willing to lose that. That became my MVP. So I started putting this on eBay and I sold all of them because everybody else was selling for 30 to $35. I sold mine for 25 to $30, including shipping. So there was $10 arbitrage, right? And $10 might not sound a lot, but if you think about it, $10 is a third, right? It's a 30% price differential from what you normally would get. And it's for a simple product. And you can do the math, right? Suddenly my MVP, my first MVP, cost me $2. I sold 1,000 of them within a couple of weeks. That worked, right? So then I went into custom guitar pedals, custom guitar cables, right? It was just soldering different cables. There was 150% margin in that. Slightly lower margin than the clip-on guitars. I continued selling the clip-on guitars, started selling the cable. It worked. And then I started bringing in the guitar pedals, right? Which only had a 50% margin, things like that. But again, people started buying it. So I was an international student. Back in those days, I could work 20 hours a week. And I had an eBay store and I had this great experience. Basically, I met musicians, right? The people in step two that I interviewed, I started selling them the product. There were early purchases, there were repeat buyers, word of mouth grew, and the question became not how I should, whether I should buy online, right? Which was a lot of people were saying, well, why would I buy online? And I shifted the conversation to why would you pay double locally? If I could bring in the product, why would you pay double locally? And eventually I had, I ended up doing my PhD. I sold the business. It was really good. It paid for a lot of things, paid for my wedding, paid for my first car, second car in Australia, and I flipped it. And there were a couple of other things in between, right? But I thought this was really interesting. This became the discipline in which I started growing. Now, did I know this was PSF? No, right? But what I knew was that this interviews component, I was studying an undergrad Bachelor of Business, Management and Marketing. And I undertook a marketing methods class, which was really boring. But one takeaway out of that class is that interviews are stronger than surveys. So I went, okay, that's interesting. I tested it, I validated it. That was my first subject in Australia. I failed the subject, but I earned money out of it, so it's fine. Now I'll give you a second story, right? So when Zara came, we met at the Adelaide Coffee Bar, right? So I'm an academic, and I also run a couple of other businesses. So this is, a more recent story, right? So, I am very passionate about coffee, and I'll take 5 minutes maybe to explain this. Um, I had passion for coffee. I drink lots of coffee. In fact, in my household, my wife and I, just the two of us, we go through about 600 grams to 700 grams of coffee beans, specialty coffee beans each week, right? Before we own the cafe. Mostly, I drink the coffee. She drinks 1 or 2 cups a day. And we always thought, we moved from Melbourne to Adelaide, and we always thought Adelaide could benefit from a better cafe experience, right? You like something and you start asking this question, right? You get itchy, like, why can't they do that? Why don't they make their coffee this way? Why is the food a bit cold? Why is the portion so small? And then one of my friends joke, why don't you open a cafe? Huh. Why don't we open a cafe? Now I had, after Brock Logic Melbourne, in between, I had a coffee cart in Melbourne as well. Sold that within 6 months. It was a really good, successful scale. We had an MVP, sold really fast, and that's why I enjoyed my life in Melbourne so much. It was not just the studying; it was everything else. Um, but there was an itch, right? And sometimes with the itch, the problem with us entrepreneurial spirits is that when you have an idea and you think it's a great idea, sometimes I think any human being with blood, right? I like it. I'll buy it. Does it make business sense? I don't care. I like it. I'll buy it. So we did, right? In January last year, in 2025, January, I was looking and I found a nice building and I found an interesting business that was not doing so well, right? It was failing, in fact. And I said, huh, this is interesting. I teach students, MBA students, so maybe I could transform this cafe, right? So we thought we'll do it. It wasn't a fully thought out process. Now I went through a little bit of PSF, right? I still do. Can we survive? Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have a business model. I always teach students don't test models, right? Don't test business plans, right? You always test the ideas before you build the business plans. I was like, here's the business plan. It should work. Now, problem clarity was interesting, right? This is what went through my head and my wife's head was key mantra, open a great cafe, serve great coffee, money will come in, we'll be rich. Now, we won't be rich, but this will scratch the itch. The frequency was that if you remember post COVID, especially 23, 24, even in Indonesia, the price of coffee beans skyrocketed, right? And the prices of coffee per cup started to increase. And at the same time, globally, we're experiencing a credit crunch. So inflation is up, spending power is down. However, in Australia, there was still very strong coffee and cafe sales despite price increases. Friction, right? The friction was interesting. People were actually willing to pay a premium for better coffee. Case an example, me, right? I'm again fortunate enough, but I'm terrible, right? Because I will spend my lunch money instead of buying lunch, I'll spend my whole entire lunch to buy a cup of coffee, right? Because the coffee is special. So if you go to, Jakarta has got some of these really interesting places. I went to one where a cup of filter coffee, the last time I was in Bali, was 450,000 rupiah for 1 cup of coffee, right? It tasted really good. It wasn't even kopi luwak. It was roasted, in Bali, and it tasted really good. People would pay, right, for a premium. I regretted it after drinking it. It was nice. It's 450,000 I could eat, for the whole week, right? But people were willing to pay for that. So we believed that the problem existed. There was a lot of high competition, but my wife and I, we had this idea. Jazz bar, cafe with Asian fusion food. It can work. But as we went through the more disciplined PSF, right, we realized that we won't have a customer problem. We will have a business problem. Staffing is going to be an issue. Am I going to find staff? Am I going to quit my job? I was very tempted to quit my job, but am I going to quit my job, right? Which is comfortable enough and I can run it and I actually love my job. Would I quit my job to actually support this new venture that we had? And then we realized suppliers, right, were not willing to give us good prices because we were the new kids on the block. How many are you going to buy 10? No, we'll start by buying one. Okay, if you buy 10, the price is 5. If you buy one, the price is 7. Right? So right off the door, we realized that we our business is going to cost us a lot more money, right? And the barrier to success, right, is really, really high, right? Compared to the cafe that might be two doors down. And then one other thing we realized, my wife and I, we were so excited about the venue. do you realize there's no kitchen? I was like going, what do you mean there's no kitchen? You can't cook inside the venue. But the previous owners had a little stove. Yeah, that's why they got shut down because they're not allowed to cook in there. We didn't think about that. So suddenly this was looking like a very, very expensive mistake, right? And my wife and I, we just signed a 5 + 5 year lease. So it's a 10-year lease commitment all up. And we were like, oh, this is going to be really bad. So then our problem, right, became really clear. The problem wasn't, can we great cafe serving great coffee, but the problem became, how do we create a viable operating model? So we went through this process, right? And I started talking, in between that period. So we took over on the 1st of April 2025. We opened the cafe in January, right? It took us 10 months to get permits, to get the renovation underway. We still had to pay rent, but it took us that long. And in the meanwhile, what we started doing was, if I frame this in the three-layered stack, is that instead of looking at customer evidence, because our problem is an operational model problem, we looked at the ecosystem evidence, right? I went to a lot of cafes. I was spending a lot of money on coffee, right? So a lot of the cafe owners were all my friends, and we started talking, and they said, "Oh, you're gonna start a cafe? Great, really interesting." So I asked them, and I said I wanted to do some research as well. So it's actually one of the research paper that hopefully will get published at the end of this year, is interviewing, how cafes actually survive in the face of adversity, right? So I started interviewing cafe owners about their challenges. What were the things that you had issues with? And every time I wanted, because I was looking for businesses to buy. So all these agents keep on sending me, right? Here is a cafe for sale. Great, profitable cafe for sale. Great. I said, I'm interested. But what I was really interested in is reading their P&L statements, right? So being an academic had its usefulness. You can do market research, proper market research. So what I observed was staffing realities, cost structures, and operational bottlenecks. It was actually really evident, right? When was the peak period of sales, right? When was highest coffee sales recorded? What happens during winter? What happens during school holidays? What happens during events? What happens when you have too many staff, right? Because you can see all of this through P&L statements. So I basically did extensive research through and gained observational insights from there. And I also started partnering with key partners. There were companies that I would like to partner with, and I started partnering with them, and they came along the journey. And what was interesting is, in terms of the learning loops, right? The challenge wasn't the demand for coffee, but how do we operate sustainably at a small scale? So this was what happened out of the ecosystem evidence. We refined the problem, and it gave us a new idea. The question that people were asking was, hey, instead of building from scratch, why don't you take something that is already functioning and leverage the system? That was the advice that I kept on getting, right? Instead of trying to start this, just fold that and do this. And I went, what if I can do one better, right? So through talking to a few people, there's a lot of Indonesians, and Indonesians are very entrepreneurial. Do you know, by the way, we are number 6 in the world in terms of number of startups in the world, like around the world, for 4 years running, right? So that's something. And there was a guy that I met, a fellow Indonesian, an academic. He finished his PhD. His name is Harry. I'm pretty sure he doesn't mind me saying this. He might even be in this lecture, actually. I don't know whether I did tell him I was coming. And it was really interesting. He graduated, with his PhD about 2.5 years ago. And while he was doing his PhD, he started one Indonesian noodle franchise called Bakmi Lim, right? So it sells noodles, a little bit like Bakmi GM, the Australian version. And he ran it under a franchise model, and then he started a cafe called Merantau. Can you tell where he's from? Definitely Indonesian. And then he started a Pokeball outlet called Tempe, right? So suddenly there was this connection, and we started talking. He said, I'm actually interested in becoming an academic full time. I was like, okay, interesting. I'm interested in becoming a hospitality owner. So we got talking, and a few months went by, 6, 7 months went by. I started observing, right? Because our problem is not serving great coffee. That is a given. That is operational. Our problem is how do we leverage? We started looking at his system. He had a central kitchen, shared staffing, and the question was, how do I keep the staff in terms of staying? Suddenly we have economies of scale, right? There's suppliers who used to tell me, hey, you're a small fish, I don't want to talk to you. Suddenly, if I told them, I run for venues, give me better pricing, otherwise I'll go to somebody else. It made for really easy negotiation. Suddenly, I was still very small. I haven't had any businesses in Adelaide. I appeared to be this huge operator, right? But actually, no, there was a system behind it. And this was validated by the data, right? So the solution resonance is this. Now it's early days, but what's interesting is, sort of we leverage the system. We instead of would customers really switch, well, can we expand the system, right? And instead of would they pay, we ask this question in terms of the solution resonance, would we actually reduce costs, right? And the answer to that was yes. How did I build my MVP? Well, I spoke to their current staff, right? And I went, what if I gave you an opportunity to contribute and to grow? Now imagine, right? I don't know how many of you ever work in hospitality, right? I don't know what the slang is in Indo for hospitality. Basically, if you work at McDonald's, if you work at the warung, what is to what extent, what is the scale of your future, right? You make coffee, you're a barista at Starbucks, for instance. You might be stuck Starbucks, you start as, a junior, you become a barista, you become a senior barista, you become a trainer, you become a manager, and then you stay there for the rest of your life, right? Chances are you won't have any chances to grow. So with this, right, because I'm a HR academic, I like high performance work systems, high performing teams. And I know that once you have the right people, you need to give them the motivation, right, to be able to grow, but also the opportunity for them to grow. So I use my academic superpowers and I went two or three, well, three of the key staff, just going, this is my vision. I'd like you to stay on, and here is what is on offer for you. I don't want you to just be a cafe manager, right? I want you to be able to write systems for me and effectively run the rostering across the board. I would like one of them, who is my kitchen boss, right? She's also from Indonesia. She's great. I said, I want you to be my operations manager, right? I'll offer you a full-time job as an operations manager. Suddenly, she is no longer just a baker, a kitchen hand, but she became an operations manager, right? Again, it gives people opportunities to grow. We tested out workflows, and there were, again, other staff members got excited because suddenly products were being sold. Now, in the last 4 months, it's officially just under 4 months, right? It was really interesting. Here are my behavioral proxies as to how the PSF was successful. There was staff buy-in. Everyone apart from one left the business, right? We have new products being developed, being sold across all of the venues. In fact, it's in Indonesia you have like the Gojek Eats, right? In Australia we have Uber Eats, where you can buy food from places online. One of the exciting new things we are, as of in 2 weeks' time, expanding another brand to the portfolio. And all this, I don't work in the business, right? All these are running by itself, which is quite scary, but also interesting at the same time. We're going to have a new kitchen run out of the same central kitchen that we have, introducing a different twist to Indonesian snack. At Marantau, which is already busy to start with, we basically added a new coffee brand. We had product lines from Adelaide Coffee Bar being transferred into Marantau, and year on year took over 3 months, right? Year on year, every single week, every single weekly period, we've seen 20% year on year growth, right? So by doing nothing, in fact, I've given the staff more work, right? But I believe because PSF actually opened up opportunities for them to see different ways of doing things, we're seeing growth. For Adelaide Coffee Bar, we were expecting to lose money for 6 months. And inshallah, within 6 weeks, we hit break-even point. So we have, we're not profitable yet, but we haven't lost money, right? And for the last 4 months, why? Because we have this system. So why do I share these stories? Again, right? I want to bring back to this, which I'm with, and that is, it's not a single framework, right? It's not a single framework. It is applicable not just to entrepreneurship, uh, sort of problems, but to a lot of things. It can be applied beyond the customer, right, to the business model itself. And in fact, I would encourage you, right, the next step of your business model canvas will be product market fit, right? But PSF is doesn't stop there. And in fact, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Now, I'm going to close with a well-known case study very, very quickly. But this is the case for the long road ahead, right? So there's this case. If you, there's a lot of books on this. But basically, if you Google up Quincy Apparel, there's a really well-known famous case study about two Harvard MBA graduates, right, who identified a gap in the market. And that was that they started work as management consultants. They say we can't get affordable work clothes that actually fit well for women, right? It was either too loose, too uncomfortable, or too tight, and too expensive. And they discovered through, because they went through the MBA, they went through a class like yours, right? PSF, what is PSF? They identified the perfect PSF. In fact, they discovered the problem, right? That sizing for women's clothes started in 1942, right? It assumes that all women have an hourglass figure, right? The ladies, you would know what it means, right? But from one manufacturer to another, unlike men's t-shirts, where a small is a small, a large is a large, an extra large is an extra large, a size zero for one brand would be very different for a size zero from another brand, right? There was actually no consistency. And they also didn't take bust sizes into account, which meant that it was really hard to get the perfect fit. So these two ladies, they launched this idea called Quincy Apparel, right? 1 year on after graduating from the MBA, they were working for a large consulting firm and they said, hey, let's do this. And people loved it. They considered the frequency, the friction, the alternative, ticked all of the boxes. In fact, for the data, because again, right, they're nerds. They say, oh, we got to do this, right? We have to do the survey. So they undertook a survey which confirmed their hypothesis, right? That is, 57% of women said that fit clothes that fit them well was the most important factor as to why they would buy the clothes. But more interestingly, 81% of their survey respondents said it's really hard to find clothes that fit. So from there, they went on and, what is the total addressable market, so on and so forth, right? The TAM, the SOM. And then they started with an MVP. They said, what if we had a customizable product? And they did, right? So it validated the hypothesis. In fact, 25%, right? They ran these trunk shows. 25% who attended made a purchase. And remember, this was 2009 as well, right? 2009, 2010. So there was also an interesting conversion rate for professional women, right? Again, I think Americans can be quite crazy, but the average sale value at a trunk show for the MVP was 350 US dollars. Equivalent of today's money is about 500 US dollars per purchase, per transaction. So what went wrong, right? What could go wrong, right? After 10 months of they went kaboom. They had funding, couple of CEOs, they shut down. So why did that happen? Well, if you look at the reason why it didn't happen, right? So if you look at this, PSF is important. It outlines the problem. The issue with Quincy Apparel was the next couple of stages, right? So the next couple of stages is really important. They had the activities. They had the stage one, the discover, right? They had the problem, they validated it, they defined it, they delivered it, they measured it, and that's really good. But they didn't have key partners. So they understood, right? For MVP, we'll buy a couple of fabric that work really well. Their key partners discovered that, oh, at the volume that you're looking for, we don't have this fabric. So we have a different fabric instead. So they had to apologize to customers, hey, this wouldn't fit so well, right? But it's okay. Their customer relationships were really good. They got good channels. They got good segments of the market. But the key partners, key resources did not work out well. and the cost structure and the revenue streams just blew up because they were expecting X amount of returns, right? In the business model, they said, oh, we're expecting 20% rate of return. They had 37%. So suddenly your profitability from your revenue, it became the EBITDA instead of being 10% of revenue, became 5, became 3, became 1, became negative at some points. And if you ever work with venture capitals or people who fund you, they expect a return on investment, right? So what happened was it just did not work out well for them and they shut. So again, PSF is really important, but I want to bring your minds back to the business model canvas. Again, it's a really crucial part. It's not the only thing. And if I can give you one last tip, is that when you look at entrepreneurship, right, one of the most valuable lessons I have learned is that you have to be able to zoom out and take an eagle's eye view. And the BMC is a really useful tool, right? A lot of the times you think it's so annoying, right? What do you mean I have to sit down and list out what each one of my activities are? Can't I just do this? Right? No, you can't. Trust me, right? If you don't have a systematic structure to it, you're going to miss out on certain things, and this is where problems start arising. So this is the discipline before the scale, and without this discipline you won't be able to scale. So with that in mind, I'll stop sharing, and I might take some questions or just hand over to Zara.
Oh, thank you, Mulyadi. Thank you for the really, really interesting like presentation. In this case, even for me, this is actually a lot of actually I have new insights, especially you're actually started your business during your what undergrad years, right? When I did my PhD, I didn't even think about like starting a business. That's just like how can I actually finish his PhD? That is my problem at that time. So yeah, we're in different situation at that time, right? So anyway, very interesting. I did actually take some of keynotes even for myself, right? And on that note, actually, I Googled when you asked what's the price of Coca-Cola. To be honest, I don't even drink Coke in Indonesia or Australia. I have to Google it. It's like what 5,000 rupiah for the bottle one. And then like the what do you call it, the 1 liter one is like 10,000 a dollar, right? It's actually quite cheap in Indonesia. So anyway, I know this is actually the weather is quite gloomy right now in Depok. At least some of the students probably is actually at home because of this online Zoom class. So I'm actually just want to open like a question and answer session. Remember, like I think Dr. Mulyadi Robin is actually a very good resource because he actually an academic and also a business owner, several businesses, right? Something that's already successful, and then he actually sold it, got some capital gain, and then he started like that business, like at Adelaide Coffee House, which I did actually visit it, but I don't have the time to taste the coffee at that time. I will have to go back to Adelaide to actually try that. So anyway, any questions from the students in here? I know like in my class, we actually have this case study. We have, what do you call it, a real life case study because I asked students in my class, in groups, of course, to have one UMKM or MSMEs, and they actually try to help them. Hey, you guys, as the consultant, in this case, they're consultants, can you actually try to help these MSMEs to, I don't know, improve their business, increase the scale, and maybe it's a bit different for other classes. I think Budewi also in here, Budewi classes. I don't know whether you also use that kind of method. But anyway, I think I have one person who's going to already raise his hand. Is it Muhammad Fazel? Yes, please open your camera. Yeah, maybe when you want to ask question, it's just like courtesy. Yes, Muhammad Fazel.
Okay, sorry. I just want to ask one question to Mr. Mulyadi. So he told us before that he had several businesses, like, and not all of them are profitable. Like some of them are still even uh, haven't even reached break even. And like with your years of experience in business, especially, it's overseas, not really. So it's like more structured. Because I know in Australia it's more hard to get like permits, stuff like that. What is like at what point does you stop, like you know that this business is like it's not worth continuing anymore, like okay, at what loss do you stop, or maybe like I don't know. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Mohammed Fazil. So I, sort of, I take on, sort of again, right, like introduce the effectuation perspective, right? So I always start, and again, this is something that you have to analyze for yourself. I don't think there's a magic answer, or there is a rule of thumb. Well, there is a rule of thumb, and that is, sort of usually, unless it is groundbreaking, you should always budget for 6 months of from product launch or operations, right, before you hit break-even point. That's the argument, right? That's the rule of thumb across a lot of businesses. Now, some businesses go there quicker, some businesses go there later. But the most important thing, sort of for me in terms of my personal approach to business is because I have a family. I have a job, I have a family, right? And I have children. So you can lose money, but how much am I willing to lose, right? So the reason, sort of again, part of the reason why I haven't had multiple business ventures after my first few. So the last, I buy and sell guitars online still for fun, right? It's really fun because I get to play them, I get to make some money, but also I had to minimize risk for my family, right? Because I have three very young children. I have an 8-year-old boy, a almost 3-year-old girl, and a 7-month-old boy. My wife doesn't work presently because she's just given birth, right? And so we had to minimize our risk, right? So the question that we had was, how much were we willing to lose, right? And that became, again, the discipline that helped clarify the or help inform the problem clarity, right? Because that also helped us validate, because that was one assumption that we had. When I said earlier, I think, with PSF, the guidelines is always you have to state every single assumption. My assumption for every single one of the things that I've done is always, can I make money within X number of whatever that period is, right? If it's a month, if it's a year, if it's 2 years, and again, it depends on the industry that you're in. A really good friend of mine is doing, a number of startups. He is an angel. He does a lot of this angel investing, right? I thought he was very rich, but he's not. But he calculates it really, really interestingly. He doesn't make an investment unless he thinks he will make the first return in 3 months. So I was talking to him and I said, why do you make that decision? He said, well, risk minimization. But also, he said, at this stage, I'm happy earning anything above bank interest rather than making 100 times, right? Because the risk is you put money in something, it could be the next Dropbox, it could be the next Uber, it could be the next Gojek, um, but it could also be the next, 15,000 companies that failed beside it. So he would rather invest in a smaller stage. So, long story, long answer to a short question is, I think it's got to be your risk appetite. But the rule of thumb, again, is 6 months, but it really depends on what. I mean, OpenAI, at the moment has been operating for, I don't know, what, 5 years now, and it's still not profitable. In fact, every single day they're losing millions of US dollars. I read an article the other day. They had a image generation engine called Sora, and it was rolled out for free for pro users. Right? I tried it, and I was like, "Oh, you get 3 credits to do this," and then suddenly it disappeared. And I was wondering, why did it disappear? Well, turned out that each day, Sora was costing them 2.5 million US dollars in terms of losses, right? So how, they're $1 billion plus company. But again, if it was you or I, we probably have stopped it. But again, different governance model. So yeah,
Okay, thank you, Mister.
that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Muhammad Fazal from Class B. Any other questions while we're still here? I think it's quite interesting what you said before, right? About like how much money you want to you're okay to lose, or actually about like the risk taking. I think age is also play a part in that, right? I mean, like whether you're still young, you're like, for
Mm.
instance, you're in the undergrad years, or whether you're in a PhD. Like for me, like never thought of that when I was doing my PhD in Melbourne. But maybe I'm actually questioning myself if I did go there when I was still in my early 20s, right? Without any family or without any like plan for getting married and such. Probably I might think of starting a business, probably. So, and this is actually quite, maybe quite inspiring for you guys, some of the international students, the KKI students, because some of them is actually doing a double degree where they're having like 2 years in Indonesia and also 2 years abroad. If it's Australia, it can be University of Melbourne or maybe University of Sydney or ANU. I think it's for a master degree. Yeah, but some of them I still remember back in 2010 or 11 when I was teaching KKI, I had a very smart student, right? And I actually just found him in LinkedIn around 4 or 5 years ago, and he was one of the co-founder or the VP of Fore. It's actually Fore Coffee. So that's actually a good thing too. Like people who graduated from Universitas Indonesia, we don't really have always to become an employee, right? We actually can become an entrepreneur, like start our own business. But we also can actually try to be like Mulyadi in here. He actually can pursue this academic career, like from a lecturer and then now is associate professor, associate dean, um, and then still have some of like several ventures. And also he actually not just having ventures, but he also bring a taste of Indonesia to Australia. So I said to some of my students in my class, hey, I know some of you guys will only go abroad and then after that you return back, you're going to open your restaurant in Kemang using your papa and mama's money. And I hope by having this class, you won't go bankrupt and just like spending your parents' money. I hope by attending this class, you actually can think, yes, if I want to open a restaurant when I return from overseas, probably in Kemang, or somewhere in South Jakarta, Jakarta Selatan, I hope you're going to have a successful business. Yeah. I hope that's what you can take from this class. And I hope that you actually can take not just one thing, at least five, because that's actually part of the assignment, five key takeaways from this guest lecture. I believe yes, after this, Dr. Mulyadi already sent me the PPT. So for students in my class, you're going to find it in your Emas Tiga. For students in other classes, if they don't use Emas Tiga, you're actually going to have it in a WhatsApp group. But enough of me babbling. Do you still have any questions? Or maybe from fellow lecturers, Bu Dewi maybe? I think I still see Bu Dewi in here. Any questions? I think Bu Dewi is also a good example.
I'm typing
She's
my question, Bugara. I'm
Oh,
typing
okay.
them.
Budewi is actually also an academic and also an entrepreneur. So even me, I actually want to have her as my role model because maybe I should start my own company uh, besides like this academic role. So
It's never too late.
Budewi,
The only thing too late is, the only negative side is, so I'm very glad I did this. So I have a very structured day. I used to not have a very structured day, but every day I wake up at 4:30 to 5 a.m. And I spend 2 hours, the first 2 hours of my day, at the cafe. Bending down, unloading, loading. I just hit 40 years old, so now my body is feeling it. So I'm a bit broken. That's the only downside to starting the business. Everything else is quite fun. So
that's good to know. That's good to know. Okay, I'm over 42, so that's actually a bit, a bit, yeah, a struggle for me, I think. But hey, better late than never, right? Better late than never. So I also got a lot of like key takeaways from this, what do you call it, lecture? We call it a lecture, right? It's a guest lecturing session. So again, thank you again,
that's okay.
Dr. Mulyadi Robin.
I think
I have
Budewi
checked
has a
my
question.
Is
question.
Celeb is here? Yes, Budewi is actually has a question. Yes, Budewi, please.
What is the future $1 million problem? So I think, okay, so what's been interesting, obviously, sort of, I don't know what because a lot of AI, generative artificial intelligence, started off in English, and I think it has filtered down to Bahasa Indonesia as well. I don't know how big an issue it is. One of the key things that I think is interesting, right, and why I believe entrepreneurship education is really important is that the $1 million question is how can we leverage, right? I think there's going to be a shift. How can we leverage that this generation to be able to answer questions differently? Um, so Budewi, I think very simple analogy is, I wish I was an accounting professor or lecturer in the 1980s, right? Can you imagine, 1980s computers weren't in yet, and students were learning accounting, and they literally would have spreadsheets, right? Pieces of paper, and you were writing, from side to side. It looked like Microsoft Excel cells. Overnight, Microsoft said, hey, here is a powerful software that can do all your calculations for you. I think we're in that world, and I think the $1 million question is how do we leverage things that AI cannot do, um, but that we as humans can do, and it's applicable across everything. I think not just education. I think it's in the food industry as well. I have built a little bot, AI bot, that helps my managers and my baristas to determine how much milk they should be ordering, right? And it's quite interesting. I built this little bot. And how do I build the bot? I ask AI to build it. How do I validate it? I ask AI to validate it, right? And this tool is now making my managers really, really efficient at what they do. And anyone can do this. So I think there is a lot of things that we can not replace humans with, but I think becomes the floor on which humans can then, take and use their talents and leverage it going forward. I hope that answers it. That's my standard answer to this question.
Thank you, Pak Mulyadi. I'm just wondering how you see the future. And in my class, if I can share something, Ibu Zahra, we were also discussing about AI because I was asking the students, uh, do you feel optimistic about your future? And some of them said they're actually worried. They feel worried. And then I said, why do you feel worried? And one of the source of the worry is AI.
Mm.
And then I asked them again, do you want to come back? If AI makes you worry, do you want to come back to the era when AI wasn't there? And they said they don't want to come back to the era before AI. So,
Yeah.
uh, so it's interesting to find there would be one more question then. The problem now in the era of too much information, I wonder how did you filter? How did you filter? There are so many opportunities. There are so many, yeah, I mean, like opportunities and problems.
Mm.
And then, what is your first filter to choose the business, like the restaurant, and then
Yeah.
the guitar, the music, online
Yeah.
music store, things like that? How was the first filter that made you choose that particular business field?
Yeah. Not very interesting question. So my first filter has always been the question of, am I passionate about this? Right. So I think it's a mix of intuition and passion. Um, it's like doing the PhD. I have at the moment I have 4 PhD students, and there's one who wanted to start at the start of this year and applied. Right. I want to do leadership, and the question I always ask is, can you look at this problem Can you think and look at one problem for 3 years, every single waking moment of your life, right? If you can, sure, let's come ahead and go and do your PhD. Otherwise, don't worry about it. And I use that often as a filter, right? If I'm stuck, and I think, the risk is like what Muhammad Fazal asked earlier, right? What is the risk? Well, the risk was because I'd signed up to a 10-year contract, right? For 10-year lease for the building. I go, we either might lose our house or I quit my job and I basically get underpaid as a barista, right? And work minimal wage. And I had to ask myself, all right, if I was to do that for 3 to 5 years, would I be okay? And that was part of, you know, the justification. But at the start, I got to be able to be passionate about it because I think if you're not passionate about it, there's no point in doing the other bit. So, and that passion it could start as a hobby, it could start as a curiosity.
Mm.
I think what was interesting with the guitar one was I like guitars. I like
I can see it
having
in your
things.
background,
Yeah, it's
in the
still they're still in my
background.
background. But sort of, I don't know, right? I don't know if so you can see it. It's my room is very
Yeah,
messy. It's
yeah.
all there,
See,
Ooh.
all over.
it's this is enthusiast. This is a militant
um,
guitar
yeah,
hobbyist.
but the question that I asked was, I think what interested me was the pricing anomaly. It wasn't.
Mm,
It was the opportunity to make money. If I was to be honest, right, as an undergrad student at 21, I said, how can I make money? That was,
mm,
and I went, oh, there's this interesting bit, and it so happens that it's part of my hobby, right? So I think whatever the driver is, you got to be able to have some level of ownership and passion. Don't start a restaurant because it's trending. Cafes are worse than startups. So in Australia, as of last month, I was, because I'm doing the other research. So we were trying to get figures, right, from the Australian tax offices. One in five cafes have closed since the start of the year. One in five across Australia, right? Because in Australia, wages are really high, taxes are really high, right? Um,
mm.
but what's more interesting is that for every one that closes, eight cafes popped up. So
What?
therein lies an issue, right? An interesting problem, right? So
Yes.
are they closing because it's not operational, or are these people entering because they're naive? And I think the answer lies somewhere
Mm,
in the middle, right? So, I
mm,
think again, if you're passionate about it, I think you'll always push, and it makes the hard times a little bit easier.
mm.
It's like if you love someone, they annoy you, it's okay. But if you really don't like them, they annoy you, I'm sorry, goodbye. And I see it the same with business. So
Okay, okay. Thank you so much. I think that's all from me, Ibu Zahra. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Bu Dewi, for like two very interesting questions. Yes. Anyone else? Anyone else? Bu Dewi already gave like two questions. It's like I'm actually pressuring my students to ask questions. I'll be honest, as a student, I also don't like asking questions. I'm that type of student who always sit at the back, always late, rarely come to class. But hey, somehow I got an A, and I never begged for what is called scores to my lecturers or my professors. So if you really that kind of students, it's fine, right? It's fine. But you can. I hope you still can take some key takeaways from this lecture, especially because that's the assignment. I'm becoming like a broken record. Hey, okay, that's Ramya Zia. Oh, this is for my class. Yes, Ramya Zia. Please turn on your camera, yeah, when you're asking question.
Maybe our students are also overwhelmed, Ibu Zahra, because of the presentation. They're overwhelmed.
I
Maybe they're
know,
still like digesting stuff.
Um,
probably.
hello.
Yes, but Ramya Zia here. Yes, feel free.
Hello. Okay. I wanted to ask to Mr. Mulyadi Robin if you were put in the position of studying abroad overseas and having to sell guitars, do you think you would still have that like entrepreneurial will or like mindset to find money even if you were in Indonesia? Because like, is that something that you have to build, or is that something that some people will just naturally have?
It's a good question. Thank you. I always okay. I think there are people who have got a knack for entrepreneurship, right? And then there are others that build it. I think sort of. I don't know if I had stayed on in Indonesia. I probably would end up having staying on in my grandfather's business as part of the family business. I think all of my cousins who stayed in Indonesia largely either they, typical from Sukabumi, either they become doctors or they work in the family business. I think there were no other options, right, for us. Um, but one of my first memory, sort of, I remember I went to Singapore. Price anomalies have been always something that interested me. Um, I don't know if you guys grew up with rubber erasers that has flags. It was green and white and has bendera on top. It's the penghapus. I used to play that as a kid, right? And in Singapore, it used to cost 50 cents. I still remember. And in Indo, I could buy it for, I think, equivalent of 10 cents. And every single time I would go back from Singapore, and I was in primary four. How old is primary four? Class 4 SD. So it was really young. I'll bring back all my pocket money and I will buy 20 or 30 of these rubber erasers, bring it to Singapore and sell it to my friends. But then I will beat them at the game and I'll win all of them back. So I started a business under there. So again, maybe I was born into a family of, it's my grandfather started the business. It was they went through struggles, etc. Maybe, but I've also seen people who have never showed any of this stuff and are some of the most successful entrepreneurs around. So I think just like leadership, I think there are people who are born with some strengths that make them leaders or make them entrepreneurs. But I think largely, sort of a lot of this you can learn and you can build the discipline because um, while the public success stories of entrepreneurs often is romanticized, right? Like, you have this hero like Elon Musk or, Mark Zuckerberg, for every one of those. If you look at the most successful stories of most successful business people in Australia, um, started off as a truck driver, right? And then built an empire. Um, but he started with one truck and worked for 20 years in one truck. And then he discovered that there are systems that he could build, that he could leverage. That's how he grew. So I think, I've heard more stories of people without this, uh, you know, hot streak or like a super charismatic presence and gifted entrepreneurs. I've heard more success stories from people who are a little bit more normal like you and I. We have an idea, we test it, we learn it, and there's lots of failures along the way, and somewhat, somehow, somewhere, it should hopefully work out. So, yeah, but I really don't know.
You will never know before you try.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for the insights, Bu Dewi. You never know before you try. Yes, great. Hope it that actually answer your question, yeah, Ramyazia. And thank you again, Dr. Mulyadi Robin, for that answer. I do remember, I think when I was in primary, in junior high school, I also did that kind of stuff. I mean, I went abroad, UK, or like, I think, yeah, UK or something. And then I brought some like magazine with Take That posters and that kind of stuff. And then I sold it back in my Al Azhar Perjatan. Yes, I did get some revenue. Now think about it. Maybe that's a sign I should start my own business now. Thank you for actually telling that story before about the rubber erasers. Anyway, we're after like 4:06 right now. Our class is actually at until 4:30, so we do still have times. Even though I said to Pak Mulyadi, oh, Bu Dewi is already giving like some happy like celebration. So any other questions? Going once, going twice. going 3 times. I think we've had a very, very nice presentation in here. We got a lot of insights. Maybe some of you guys actually thinking about like, hey, maybe that's an alternative. Going abroad, maybe try my own luck there, starting my own business when you're actually still in early 20s. And I don't know whether you want to return to Indonesia or you want to stay in Australia, becoming a PR or like, I don't know, citizen maybe. We always can actually build Indonesia anywhere we are, right? Not only in Jakarta, not only in Sukabumi, not only in our like place that we're born. We actually can help build Indonesia even from far away. And I think that's what Dr. Mulyadi Robin is doing right now. He introduced tempe, he introduced Indonesian cuisine, but he also take something that he likes from Melbourne, which is coffee. That's something that he's passionate about. Even for me, I started drinking coffee like regularly when I live in Melbourne for like 6.5 years. That's one of the reasons why I love coffee right now. So I take that passion is also something that's very important, right? If you're not passionate of something, then maybe you just like feeling not good like in doing it, right? So I think passion is also one of the key things in doing anything, whether to become an academics, entrepreneurs, or even a housewife or even a house husband. I think that's actually you need to have that kind of passion. So again, thank you. I've been saying thank you for so many times right now. It's been a good 2.5, like over 2 hours. Maybe we can have a brief, what do you call it? Take a picture. Is Mbak Ida here? Mbak Ida? Mbak Ida, are you here? Can you take a picture? Hello? Is Mbak Ida here? Can we take a picture? Oh, apparently we already took a picture before. Maybe one more when Pak Mulyadi Robin is actually smiling. Yes? And Budewi is turn on our camera. Can you please, everyone, can we turn on our camera? So this is actually something that we can give to Pak Mulyadi as a courtesy, as we actually feel grateful that he spent his time for this. Ida, can you say 1, 2, 3? You can turn on your mic if you can to say 1, 2, 3. Yes? You can open your mic and say 1, 2, 3. Okay? Mbak Ida? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this guest lecture class. I hope we're going to see each other again. Pak Mulyadi Robin, I actually want to try your coffee of yours. So everyone, have a nice day, and I'll see you next week in class. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Pak Mulyadi.
everyone. See you next week. Thank you, Pak Mulyadi.
Recording stopped.